maybe people we don't know, hadn't worked with as much. So I'm really thrilled to be able to launch this and express directly to you my enthusiasm and excitement about this program. I have a few words just thanking you, of course, for participating in this. The third data report from this program, Runway to Extinction, which also the best titles, always. These always have the best titles. And these reports are really impactful, to use a controversial word, but I think it applies here. They really do make a difference. I see them cited. I see people using them, and I see them changing people's view, changing their minds. And that's an exciting thing to do. And sometimes a little difficult. So this is obviously a difficult time. So it's a difficult time, but it's a time that really is working on wildlife crime is more relevant than other, as there's more and more evidence linking wildlife crime to criminal groups and of course to the spread of zoonotic diseases. So for those who don't know, more than 70% of emerging infectious diseases that occurred between the 40s and 2004 originated from wildlife, resulting in millions of deaths annually, in fact, and tens of billions of dollars of economic losses from a single outbreak. With COVID-19, it could cause up to $2 trillion in global economic losses. It's really, really shocking and sobering. And I'll just add, this was, I think the phrase was predicted and predictable, this outbreak. We've long anticipated something like this could happen, and it's quite shocking and sobering to see the effect of this. So nowhere is this more evident than in the travel industry, of course, where airlines have lost over $84 billion, according to our partner IATA, in net revenue this year, and 32 million jobs supported by the sector are at risk, including tourism, and have been lost due to the severe decline in travel. Under this administration, stopping international organized crime, including wildlife trafficking, remains a priority, as it does for US Congress and the American people. We have strong legislation supporting this, like the End Wildlife Trafficking Act, and we have broad stakeholder engagement. So USAID's mission is to end poverty and assist countries on their journey to self-reliance in governing democratic, inclusive societies. USAID's efforts to combat wildlife trafficking focus on building country capacity, improving effectiveness along the law enforcement chain from poacher to trafficker to seller, and from arrest through conviction, and looking at supply and demand. So these efforts strengthen rule of law, improve the security for communities that live with and protect critical wildlife populations, and ultimately, as we realize, are trying to protect us from outbreaks like this. Private sector engagement, as Richard mentioned, that's a real priority of AID. It's a strategic approach through which USAID collaborates and implements with the private sector, and it's fundamental to our development goals. And it has been to some degree forever, but very explicitly as one of our core values, for the last 15 years. So USAID now has a private sector engagement policy, which further strengthens the commitment to design and deliver our development and humanitarian programs across all sectors. And I'll note that our current administrator and our last administrator, who just stepped down earlier this year, these are the top things that they focus on. Private sector engagement is really central to our work and increasingly emphasized every year and under every administration, regardless of which side of the aisle the administration is on. The Routes Partnership specifically has enabled us to work with the air transport industry, including airports, airlines, and supporting organizations such as Seaport ADS, Traffic, WWF, and others, to understand the movement of wildlife through legal supply chains and to help bridge the gap between industry and law enforcement. So USAID is just one agency of the USG working on wildlife trafficking, and we have a very specific development niche. In our work with the U.S. National Task Force to Combat Wildlife Trafficking, we're co-chairs, the co-chairs of that, which are State Department and Interior. We rely on and appreciate the efforts of our interagency colleagues, and I mean that very sincerely. And I'm very appreciative myself of the variety of expertise and influence that our partners bring. So our work with the other USG agencies that we haven't worked with as much before this task force, and I would say also through this program, include ESA, Fish and Wildlife, we do work with extensively, Department of Homeland Security, Commerce, and State, have been really critical to making this partnership effective. So I just want to congratulate all the Routes partners on a successful year of implementation. The open source data provided through the other data reports from C4ADS, In Plain Sight and Flying Under the Radar, like I said, great titles, have been put to very, very good use. most recently is supporting evidence to a prioritization process under the END Act that helped us to update priority countries for combating wildlife trafficking efforts. And I really look forward to seeing the work on this report applied as well and to hearing more about it. So thank you again for your participation. And I want to hand it over to you, Michelle Owen, who's the routes lead. And I will just offer my appreciation, Michelle, for your great work in moving this forward and pulling everyone together. So thanks. And I look forward to hearing more.
Thank you, Cynthia. It's great to hear your support, and obviously the Rights Partnership wouldn't be anything without the support from USAID and the FAB office. Before I go into a little bit more detail about what Rights has been doing, and I'm going to hand back to Richard because I know he's got a little poll that he would like to do beforehand. So Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, and Emily, if we could go to the next slide and we can take a look at our poll. And thank you, everyone, for all of the chats that you've been putting in here for us. Speaking of which, for the first question here, if you could chat in what country you're calling in from, we'd love to know that. So you can go ahead and put that in the chat, just as I have done. And after you're done with that, you can move on to our second poll, which we'd love to know what region you're most interested in. Your choices being Africa, Americas, Asia, Europe, Middle East, or Oceania. So please take a moment to also fill out our poll. As we've just heard from Cynthia, this issue of combating wildlife crime in the air transport sector has really only grown in importance over the last few years. As Cynthia mentioned, not only is it a criminal act and is it something that is helping to fuel criminal gangs, it is also furthering the potential transmission of zoonotic diseases like COVID-19, which has resulted in an estimated $2 trillion loss. This kind of data, like we're going to hear today, has, as Cynthia mentioned, really helped to inform and prioritize our actions. So we're really grateful for the work of C4ADS and are looking forward to hearing more about their work. I see a bunch of folks are chatting in. We're seeing a lot from USA, from Canada, some folks from Latin America, Malaysia, Liberia, Singapore. So quite a diverse group of folks on the line today. So thank you all for joining. Please, if you haven't already, go ahead and chat in your country where you're dialing in from. And I'm going to give it one more second here on the poll to see if anyone has any other answers they want to add in. But if not, go ahead and let's close the poll, if you would, Emily, and see the results. It's always a fun moment for technology to see if it all comes together. Can you bring up the poll, Emily? Poll results. While Emily is still working on that, I also do want to note for everyone that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for download soon afterwards. In terms of the answer here to our what region are most people interested in, it looks like the Americas has topped the list there with 21%, with a tie for Africa and Asia coming in at 10% respectively, and then 2% for Europe, the Middle East. But most of you didn't answer our poll. Shame on you. Next time I'll leave that poll open a little bit longer so we can get everyone's answers in there. But thank you all for chatting in your answers to our question about where you're calling in from. With that, I am going to turn it back to you, Michelle. Michelle, for those of you who don't know, is the routes lead. And Michelle, you have been helping oversee strategy execution for the routes partnership since it was incepted. And before coming to routes, you spent over a decade in Southeast Asia managing projects to protect biodiversity in important areas while looking after the economic growth of the local communities in those areas. So Michelle, thank you for your leadership of the routes partnership.
Thank you, Richard. And I'd just like to go back to what Cynthia was saying, that as part of the efforts to combat wildlife trafficking, Rights has been instrumental in addressing the means by which traffickers move wildlife products from source to demand countries, And really that's only possible through the support from USAID, but also everybody who's working with the partnership, and I will touch on those people soon. So we're working with the air transport industry, governments, UN agencies and civil society. And through that, Routes has built a partnership that helps to disrupt wildlife trafficking and forms a key element of the concerted international response to address wildlife poaching and associated criminal activities. And through Routes and our core partners, some of those I can see on the call today, which is great. And they include, obviously, USAID, US State Department, the Fish and Wildlife Service, Homeland Security, ACI, C4IDS, IATA, WWF, and Traffic. We've managed to build awareness within the industry of wildlife trafficking, and we have also witnessed companies and airports embedding solutions and responses into their policies and practices over the past sort of 4 years that we've been working on Routes. And this has been supported by the identification of recommendations based on analysis and wildlife trafficking gap assessments, the development of training resources and innovative actions to improve detection of wildlife products and reporting of potential trafficking instances to support a law enforcement response. Many of the resources that have been developed by Routes, including the Runway to Extinction report, which Mary will go through today, are freely available through the Routes website. And that's really helping to improve accessibility to all those outside of the partnership that we engage with directly. So as probably most of you know, although primarily the growth in infrastructure and transport routes facilitates legal trade, it is abused for the illicit transport of wildlife and their products. And the release of the Runway to Extinction report as part of a series of 3 reports has helped to raise the profile of wildlife trafficking risks that the air transport industry is exposed to. It also illustrates how other criminals exploit the same vulnerabilities within the supply chain. So we hope that improving counter wildlife trafficking methods should also help to prevent the transport of other contraband. Now, it's all very much on our minds, and I've seen it come through on some of the chat questions as well. But the current pandemic has had a devastating impact on the aviation sector. It's also raised the profile of the potential impact that diseases linked to wildlife trade can have across the globe, as well as highlighting the future economic risks posed to the sector from zoonosis and the illegal wildlife trade. Despite that, it is heartening that despite the challenges currently being faced, companies are contacting us for information and resources and have shown their interest in addressing wildlife trafficking as part of their response and efforts to build a resilient and sustainable future. So within this current environment of uncertainty, there is hope, and we're looking at how we adapt and respond to the industry's needs and the risks posed from wildlife trafficking to public health, as well as investigating how the broader application of Routes' technology approaches could reduce future zoonotic risks in wildlife trade supply chains. It's really encouraging to see so many people from different organisations on the call today. And it's also, I think, a reflection of the opportunities and where we need to work together across different disciplines. We need that, and I think it's been demonstrated through the Routes partnership that collaboration across multiple sort of actors and professions is needed for us to be successful in stopping wildlife trafficking, both regionally and globally. So thank you for giving your time to join us today. I'm going to hand back to Richard and let you all get enticed by Mary into the details of the Runway to Extinction report. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Michelle. And as I've been strolling through the comments here in the chat, we're seeing a lot of really good questions here coming up, and I'm going to turn it over to Mary in just a second. But I would say right now I'm seeing sort of 3 trends in the questions there that are coming in. One is about lessons learned over the 5 years of Routes. So maybe we can come back to that after Mary's presentation. So be thinking about that, Michelle. We're also seeing a lot of questions about lessons learned in terms of who and how to partner with folks in combating wildlife crime, and trends in prevention, detection, and enforcement, which is really, I think, a lot of what Mary Untermalen is going to talk to us about. And Mary, you direct the natural resource programs for C40DS, and as such, you oversee its illegal logging, mining, fishing, and narcotics portfolios. You previously oversaw the data analytics produced under the Routes Partnership, and you helped to co-author all 3 reports, including today's Runway to Extinction report. And we're so glad to have you with us to give us an overview of the data in this report. So Mary, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Richard. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you great, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much to everyone on the call for joining us today. So as Richard just mentioned, I was formerly the lead for the data and analytics produced under the Routes Partnership. That's now the territory of my colleague Ben, who's actually on the line today. So if anyone has any very recent questions, definitely direct them to him at the end of the call, or throughout the call actually, because he will know better than I do about recent trends. But today I'm going to, let me see actually if I have control of this presentation. Oh, okay, I do. So today I'm going to go through some of the primary trends and case studies from Runway to Extinction, beginning with an introduction to C4DS and our work under the Routes Partnership, followed by about 4 of our main takeaways from the report, and then the overall and regional trends we observed over the past year or so. We'll end with a discussion of our recommendations, other available Routes resources, and what's next for the Routes Partnership. I should mention as well at this point that I do have a lot of case studies and examples throughout this presentation. I don't have quite enough time to get to all of them, so I'm going to be prioritizing 1 or 2 per region. If anyone would like me to go into more detail or to address one of the case studies that I've kind of skipped over, definitely feel free to put that in the chat or to contact me after the call, and I'm happy to provide more detail on that. Let me see. I'm trying to move to the next slide, but it's giving me a bit of trouble.
If it doesn't work, Mary, just say next slide and Emily can advance the slides for you.
Sure. Theoretically, I have control, but it's just not really working. So maybe it would be better if I just say next slide. So Emily, if you want to take back control and go to the next slide, thank you. Obviously, C4DS conducts the analysis under the Routes Partnership, and we do that by relying on what we consider the 3 pillars of our organization, which are our analysts, our data, or the information that we compile and have access to, as well as the technology that we either have access to or build ourselves. For this project specifically, we rely on a team of multilingual analysts to identify seizure data within government press releases, NGO reports, CITES reports, and credible news articles about seizures specifically in airports. Then we compile that information within the C4DS air seizure database, which forms the basis of the analysis that we produce or that we have produced over the past 3 years. We then rely on members of our data team. We have 2 members of our data team on the call today to help process that data and create the maps and visualizations that we use within our reports. Can you go to the next slide, Emily? Thank you. So speaking of our reports, as Michelle mentioned, we have written a series of 3 reports under Routes. The first report was called Flying Under the Radar, published back in 2017. That report focused on ivory, rhino horn, reptile, and bird seizure data from 2009 to 2016. In Plain Sight, the second report, published the following year, expanded that initial data set of 4 wildlife categories to include pangolin, marine species, and mammal seizure data from 2009 to 2017. With this year's report, though, with Runway to Extinction, we wanted to do things a bit differently. We felt that we had looked at wildlife category trends and routes and methods pretty comprehensively over the past 2 years, and so wanted to change things up a little bit. So this year we focused on regional analysis, so the report is divided into regional sections. And we also focused on just a 3-year period, 2016 through 2018, in order to focus on more recent trafficking trends rather than just essentially focusing on this broader time span that we've already done for the past 2 years. So within Runway to Extinction, we made sure to highlight any main themes or trends or patterns that we had seen in our data throughout the report. But there were 4 main themes that stood out to me in particular. Emily, if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So the first trend that we saw, and we've seen this with all 3 of our reports, but we continue to see that wildlife trafficking is really global in scope, with seizures reported increasingly frequently. It's a pretty straightforward theme, but I think it is still important to highlight. And I should mention also that we've actually seen that change this year because of coronavirus, which I will address a bit later in the presentation. Next slide, please. The second main trend that we have seen is that wildlife trafficking routes and methods are determined more by the type of wildlife being trafficked than by the regions trafficking attempts pass through. We see that actually, I'll address that a couple more times throughout the presentation because it really is a really common trend that we see repeatedly within our data. Next slide, please. The third trend that we see, our main trend that I wanted to highlight, was that each region's exposure to wildlife trafficking is primarily determined by its proximity to specific source regions and demand markets. This is, again, pretty straightforward, but I think it's good to highlight that we are seeing what is pretty intuitive. We do see that reflected in our analysis consistently. Next slide, please. And finally, for the fourth main theme that I wanted to highlight today, as Michelle mentioned, traffickers of all types, including wildlife, exploit the same vulnerabilities within airports. So if we are increasing our counter wildlife trafficking efforts and abilities within airports, we're likely going to start seeing more wildlife seizures, but also more seizures of other types of contraband, like drugs or even sometimes firearms, different things like that. So definitely an important thing to try to address the loopholes and gaps that allow wildlife trafficking to continue to increase within airports. Next slide, please. Thank you. So on that first point about the scale of wildlife trafficking, what we're looking at here is the trafficking instances within our data from 2016 to 2018 for the entire world. So obviously quite a few trafficking instances here. And just to be clear, because we know that trafficking instances is a term that is not necessarily intuitive to everyone, but when I say trafficking instances, I mean a singular incident of wildlife trafficking moving through a country, whether or not it was stopped there. So for example, if we're looking at a shipment of turtles that originated in India, passed through Malaysia, and then was seized later in Thailand, we would count that within our database as a seizure for Thailand, as well as a trafficking instance for India, Thailand, and Malaysia. And that allows us, as we're doing our analysis, to really focus on the Indian and Malaysian elements of that shipment, even though they didn't actually make a seizure. So otherwise it gets very difficult. So the table on the left also looks at trafficking instances, and we can see pretty clearly that China is far and away, at least during this 3-year period, had kind of by far the most trafficking instances, about 3 times as many trafficking instances as the next most frequent country in our data. Next slide, please. Thanks. So about the methods and that trafficking methods that or transport methods and trafficking methods that we saw within our data. Again, as within every report that we have written thus far for the Routes Partnership, checked luggage again was dominant by seizure count. And there are a couple of wildlife products that we see, like ivory, that at least in the past were more frequently moved, or arguably more frequently moved by air freight. But still, checked luggage is just definitely by far with each wildlife category that we're looking at the most prevalent transport method. So on the other end of the spectrum, male seizures are usually pretty limited in number, but we do believe that male seizures are likely undercounted since they tend to be reported infrequently. They're also, as I understand it, subject to fewer screening protocols, and so it naturally follows that male shipments are probably exploited quite a lot. So definitely an area where we'd like to see, or ideally would be able to improve reporting, seizure reporting, or counter wildlife trafficking efforts. And then finally, traffickers of certain species and wildlife products tend to use the same transport and trafficking methods all over the world. So that means if we're looking at, say, a bird trafficking network in the Americas and a bird trafficking network in the Middle East, there's a fairly good chance that they are at least using similar trafficking methods or transport methods, just because I think of how, for instance, you're not going to be able to, well, I won't get into it too much detail. I don't have enough time for it, frankly, but it does seem that we're seeing more of the primary trend. Sorry, I'm getting myself confused here. The primary trend that we see is really that trafficking and transport methods are tied to species and wildlife products rather than regions or really any other factor. So that I think is just an important trend that I wanted to highlight again here. If we could go to the next slide, please.
Actually, Mary, if we could pause here, we've gotten a number of questions that have come in here. So one, you said earlier that traffickers of all types exploit the same vulnerabilities within airports. Does that mean that law enforcement interventions don't make a difference, or what should we take away from that?
It definitely doesn't mean that law enforcement efforts don't make a difference. It just means that if there is a weak point at a particular airport, for instance, something that I'll talk about this more later, but if we see one corrupt baggage handler or a corrupt police officer, that weak point within the airport screening and security system, if that makes sense, allows not just wildlife, but all sorts of other contraband to move through the airport. For me off the top of my head to think of an example within protocols. But for instance, okay, so one example that we see is that if within some of the airports that we've looked at, especially in some instances, we see an airport that builds a new terminal and that new terminal has updated technology. We see then traffickers all trying to use the old terminal to avoid that new technology. So that's a pretty obvious loophole that should hopefully be addressed. So different things like that, like if there is a gap in screening protocols or some kind of issue within an airport or within the way that the industry is approaching wildlife trafficking, then that leaves an opening for all kinds of traffickers. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. No, thank you very much. Just a couple of administrative matters. First of all, thank you everyone for your continued questions in the chat. As some of you have done, you can chat those to me individually if you don't want to put them in the public chat, or you can just chat them in normally there. So please do keep those questions coming. Several of you have asked if you can get a copy of the presentation afterwards. The answer to that is yes, along with the recording for today's webinar. Just a couple of more quick questions. Alicia Grimes from USAID asked, mentions that this analysis would not be possible if it were not for the collection of data by the US government and other government agencies and the sharing of this data. What are the key challenges that remain in data collection, quality, and access, and what are some ways that can be improved, including internationally?
It's a very good question. It's also a very big question. I would say, first of all, that there is definitely across the board a lot more that we could do to not only collect user data, but also to ensure that it is uniform and relatively accurate, and then to make sure that that's published. We see, and we actually, within the past year, C4DS produced a seizure release best practice guide, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But I think that really gets to this point pretty specifically. And it talks about the fact that each country that we're looking at, or countries all over the world, do have very clearly different seizure collection, seizure reporting protocols, and that definitely affects our data. So it was difficult for us, as an example, to use different government databases that we had access to because of the differences in the way that that data was collected, the amount of work that would have to be done to combine those databases and to kind of truth that data, verify that data, and make sure that it was accurately reported. I mean, it would take a year alone just to do that. So that's why we built our own database, just based off of publicly available information. But even with that said, one thing that we'll see semi-frequently is that information that we'll receive through our partners, for instance, within our wildlife trafficking investigations that we do separately from the Routes Partnership. Often the first information that we receive turns out to be inaccurate. So it takes a few days for everyone to figure out exactly what happened and who exactly was involved, and get a really good sense for what's going on. And that's within countries that already have a really great seizure reporting protocol and collection protocol. So I think, first of all, one of the main things that needs to be done, we need to get more on the same page about what type of information we're collecting for each seizure. The storage of that data is really important. It seems to be, in some countries, different agencies hold different types of data, or they each have a different seizure database, which all has different information. So that needs to be centralized, made more uniform. It also needs to be put under an agency within different countries that is less susceptible to corruption, so that data can remain accurate and accessible, but at the same time, sensitive information associated with those seizures remains protected appropriately. And I mean, I could go on. There's a few other things. I don't want to take too much time on this particular question. I would just recommend that everyone who is interested in that look at our seizure release best practice guide, because I think it talks about this much more specifically.
Excellent. So what I'm hearing you say there is that we need to get on the same page about how we collect, store, use, and make available that data, and that you have some great resources out there in terms of your best practices guide. You particularly mentioned placing information under the auspice of an agency that is less susceptible to corruption. Scott Hayost from the Whistleblower Center asked, on that kind of, I think, on a related note, that protecting and rewarding whistleblowers is an important tool in combating global wildlife trafficking. Do you have any insights for how whistleblowers can play a supporting role in this initiative?
Within routes specifically, or just with counter wildlife trafficking through airports?
I think that question is directed at counter wildlife trafficking in general, the role of whistleblowers.
Sure. Right. So to that point, at least one of our recommendations in the report, and actually in our previous year reports as well, was ensuring that there are proper communication channels created so that people in industry as well as airline passengers are able to report any kind of red flags or other issues that they see, and that they're aware of what those red flags would look like, and they're aware of the communication channel or the hotline that they can call to provide that information. We said it's really very important because industry especially is with, or they spend, as far as I understand it, maybe I'm a little bit off here, but I believe they spend more time with at least passengers, but also check luggage and air freight than really anyone else in airports. So they're really in a perfect position to be able to identify smuggled wildlife and other smuggled products. So giving them an opportunity to report that information directly to law enforcement, and giving law enforcement an ability to be able to sift through and identify the most credible tips and follow that, I think is crucial. On whistleblowers specifically, so people within, I guess, the trafficking network that would be, or a company, or a company doing baggage handling work at a particular airport, I think they would hopefully be able to just use those same channels. We don't want to create too many communication channels with law enforcement, but I think the creation of those channels and the maintenance of those channels and awareness raising efforts so that people know what red flags they should be looking for is really important, and something that is largely missing within most of the countries that we have been looking at.
Gotcha. Well, thanks, Mary. Let's move on here. Well, please do keep those questions coming. Keep that chat lively. There's been some great ones here, so please do keep those coming. Yes, perfect. Thank you, Emily. We're going to do our next polling question here. So you've got two questions. Wildlife trafficking networks tend to change trafficking methods immediately after a seizure. So this is a little bit of what we might call like friendly feud here. So let's see if you can get these questions right. So the first question here is, do you think that wildlife trafficking networks tend to change trafficking methods immediately after a seizure? True or false? And which region counted more male seizures than seizures of any other type? Your choices being Africa, the Americas, Asia, Europe, Middle East, or Oceania. Go ahead and answer those questions, and then Mary will take us through the data and we can hear what the actual answers are. Please take a moment and fill out the poll. And then Emily, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and share the results of the poll. And as I said, please do keep those questions coming in the chat. We'll try to get to as many as we possibly can. In fact, while we're waiting for the poll results, again, a question here says, in different countries, the data or information related to wildlife trafficking comes from the government or public sector, and almost all the control is done by them. But in this case, we can contribute to the control by the 5 ways you mentioned at the beginning and work together with the government. I think they will be key to getting great results. Would you agree with that, Mary?
I believe so. I think so. if I understand what they're referring to, then yes, I would agree with that.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. So we've got our poll results here. So in respect to the question, true or false that wildlife trafficking networks tend to change, most people said false.
That is correct. When we see in our data, initially we expected that wildlife trafficking networks after seizure would pretty quickly change to try to avoid future seizures. We don't actually see that, at least within the data that we are pretty confident are linked to a particular trafficking network or trafficking networks. What we tend to see instead is that trafficking networks seem to use the same transport and trafficking methods over time, with a larger network almost seeming to cycle through trafficking methods, although of course more research would need to be done to determine whether or not that's actually what we're seeing. But certainly with some of the small to medium scale networks that we're looking at, they seem to be pretty consistent using the same trafficking methods over time, which suggests at the very least that we're probably missing a huge number of seizures or trafficking attempts that they are making. Otherwise it wouldn't be, if we were really catching everything or even catching a lot or a fair amount, they would probably still try to change their trafficking, the way that they're trafficking those wildlife or wildlife products. So that was, I think, very important to me to highlight, because it reflects how we're probably missing just so many of the wildlife trafficking attempts that are going through our airports every day.
Thank you for that. And then the second question was about which region detected male seizures. The majority of folks picked the Americas, followed by Europe and Asia. But the answer is Oceania. Fascinating. Tell us about that, Mary.
Right, so this could be primarily a factor of seizure reporting protocols, and I'll talk about this a bit more in detail later. Oceania just seems to have way more male seizures, at least reported, than any other world region. Most world regions, if I remember correctly, have about 10, 15 or so, maybe less than that, male seizures as a percentage of their total seizures. Oceania is somewhere up in 50, 52%, so a substantial difference that is at the very least driven in large part by Australia, the Australian Border Force. Their reporting protocols are great. Their seizure releases are very detailed. They're pretty soon after the seizure, they have photos and video often. And it just so happens that they either make more male seizures than everyone else or they report them more than everyone else. But definitely a model, I think, for other countries working or trying to do better on seizure reporting, especially in regards to male shipments.
Terrific. Thank you. Let's go ahead. Let's move on to our the rest of the presentation, Emily.
All right. So Emily, just so you know, for these slides, you'll have to go through a little bit quickly because there are 3 routes maps on each slide. But just one thing I wanted to highlight here quickly, looking at the African trafficking routes maps, we see a increase, kind of an uptick in trafficking instances in 2017. So if you could go one over, Emily, just go to the next slide. It should pop up. There we go. And you can see here that a lot of those instances, particularly in 2017, seem to be rhino horn seizures. So looking at the transport methods, we look at this trend in the middle here. Rhino horn does seem to be increasing, especially, and what was particularly interesting to us is that rhino horn in 2017 actually surpassed the number of ivory seizures in our database for the first time since we started collecting the data, which I think is really interesting. At the same time, those ivory seizures became smaller and smaller. When we started doing this a few years ago, a fair number of the ivory seizures we were looking at were medium, say like 50 kilograms, to large scale, obviously well above that. But now what we're seeing more and more, and Ben could speak to this more later on, but we're seeing increasing numbers of ivory seizures that are, excuse me, well under 1 kilogram. It's usually 1 or 2 or a couple people or a few people with a couple of ivory bangles or a very small amount of ivory on their persons. That could be for a few different reasons. That could be in response to ivory bans in China and elsewhere over the past few years. It could be because traffickers have realized that moving ivory by maritime is easier, better for some reason, cheaper maybe. It also could be that traffickers have realized that they're more successful or they get off with lighter penalties flying into, say, China, for instance, if they seem like a tourist that just doesn't know what's going on. And at the same time, kind of tied to the wildlife product processing trend that I have highlighted here, we've seen, well, as I mentioned, with the ivory seizures becoming smaller and smaller and by involving more ivory bangles and processed ivory, we're seeing that same trend of wildlife products that are seized in Africa or after leaving Africa more and more frequently have been processed. So the seizure that we're looking at here on the left, this is a seizure of rhino horn pieces that have clearly been painted. Obviously, they're trying to make it look like it's not rhino horn. And that's something that we really didn't see a few years ago. We're now increasingly seeing little rhino horn pieces like this, or even rhino horn powder. And it seems that's probably, again, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it is a lot easier to traffic wildlife products, especially since in the past, rhino horns are, and still now to some extent, rhino horns are trafficked in complete pieces or in pretty sizable pieces that are pretty unwieldy and get stuffed into check luggage, and often they're pretty smelly, so easy to identify in that sense. And obviously this isn't even by looking at these rhino horn pieces, they're not clearly rhino horns. So you'd really have to know what you were doing to be able to identify something like this or rhino horn powder as rhino horn. So trafficking is easier when wildlife product processing moves, and we also think that it could be a result, again, of ivory bans or similar legislation in Asia that has basically encouraged product processing to move into Africa, where perhaps enforcement isn't quite as stringent. The last thing I'll mention here quickly before moving on, Kenya continues to be a really prominent transit hub in Africa for wildlife moving from Western or Central or Southern Africa into Asia elsewhere. But one thing that we are seeing is that over the past year, couple of years, seizures and trafficking instances either made in or passing through Nairobi have actually started to decline. As far as we can tell, that may be a result of effective enforcement in Nairobi, which would be driven by sniffer dogs and how effective they can be at identifying wildlife trafficking attempts moving through transit hub airports, which is usually very difficult to do, but sniffer dogs are able to do that pretty easily and pretty quickly. So what we could be seeing here is basically just the overall long-term impact of effective enforcement over a longer time in different airports. That's great to see, and we'll continue to monitor that. We go to the next slide.
Quick question before you move on here. One person noted that it looked like between 2016 and 2018 that rhino horn went back to the same level as 2016. What do you think accounts for this, and is it truly on the rise or is it flat?
Honestly, not sure, and I think that just looking at 3 years specifically isn't really going to answer that question. You'd have to look at a broader trend. But I think it is still really significant that even though trafficking, and strangely trafficking across the board, seemed to decrease a little bit in 2018, we'll see that in the other routes maps as well. But still, rhino horn, and I think, well, Ben might know if this is still true thus far in 2019, 2020, but it's still notable to me that in 2018, rhino horn trafficking instances still numbered more than ivory. If you look at our data prior to 2016, although 2016 here is a pretty good example, ivory seizures, ivory trafficking instances used to be far more numerous than our rhino horn. So even though perhaps overall rhino horn shipments or rhino horn trafficking instances in the air transport sector aren't substantially increasing, the fact that they have overtaken ivory and still seem to be higher than previous levels, I think is still notable.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Noteworthy. Next slide, please. Thank you. So if we could, Emily, again, go through these slides pretty quickly. But the main thing that I wanted to highlight with these, or sorry, I meant to say the routes maps. So if you go back, and then you should be able to go through 2016, 2017, 2018. But anyway, what I wanted to, thank you, there we go, yeah. What I wanted to highlight there is just that, first of all, we're seeing a lot of bird trafficking instances in the Americas, as well as marine species instances leaving Mexico. And also, if we see a fair amount of domestic trafficking as well. If you go to the methods slide. Thank you. So on that point about domestic trafficking in the Americas, for whatever reason, there are a couple of potential different reasons why this might be happening, but there's quite a bit of domestic wildlife or domestic flights carrying smuggled wildlife. In part, that seems that it's partially because traffickers are poaching wildlife deep in remote regions, like deep in the Amazon, and then to be able to export that or sell that wildlife or wildlife product, they need to fly from that remote region into a more urban area, to an international airport, or to just a bigger city where they can either sell the wildlife or they can repackage it for export. So all three of these examples that I have listed here do involve domestic trafficking instances. In the first, we're just looking at a seizure of a monkey that was trafficked from Cusco to another Peruvian airport to Lima. In the second, we're looking at big cat trafficking, which we highlight in the report as something that we see pretty frequently within our data. In this instance, a tiger cub was found on the way from Jalisco to Querétaro. I think I might be pronouncing that wrong. But what's notable about this, from my perspective, is just that exotic live animal trafficking in Mexico is very prevalent. We seem to see that there's a fair amount of demand for exotic animals, especially tiger cubs and lion cubs in the Americas, in Mexico, which may be driven to some extent by demand from narco traffickers who I think approach big cat ownership as kind of a status symbol. So definitely an issue that we're still seeing, and we even see it to the extent that there are a couple of seizures that we noticed that weren't through the air transport sector, but of Americans going down into Mexico and purchasing tiger cubs and then trying to drive back up into the States. So definitely a prominent issue there. And then finally, for this third example on aquarium fish in Brazil, this one I wanted to highlight just because it kind of went against the usual trends or pattern that we see, in that it went from a bigger city, Manaus in Brazil, sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, to a much smaller, basically a town on the border between Brazil and Colombia. And as I said, usually we see things go from rural regions to urban regions, not the other way around. What's also interesting about this seizure was that this seizure and a couple other similar seizures seem to very clearly show signs of organized criminal activity. For instance, there's a series of seizures that all exhibited similar trafficking methods, the exact same route, similar species in similar quantities. So in this particular instance, we were looking at a seizure of about 670 aquarium fish. After the seizures, officials reported that they were looking at networks of traffickers that would basically acquire these fish out deep in the Amazon. It must have been pretty remote because they do semi-frequently find unknown species in these shipments. But the traffickers would acquire the fish in the Amazon, package it, and then ship it to Tabatinga, Brazil, and then smuggle it by land into Colombia. I'm not sure, I haven't heard of any arrests with that network, so definitely something that could still be happening. And also interesting because I'm not aware of a massive or a large market for aquarium fish in Colombia. So it's either the fish are either being smuggled into Bogota or Medellin or something to a market that is just not all that well known at this point, or they're being re-exported to a different country, perhaps somewhere in Europe or Asia where we know of more of a demand for aquarium fish, or aware of more of a demand for aquarium fish. So if we can move on to the next slide.
About
Sorry.
10 minutes remaining.
Okay, a lot to get through. So why don't we just skip through, frankly, the route maps because they are giving us problems anyway, and I'll just highlight a couple of important things. The main thing that I wanted to highlight for Asia is intra-Asian trafficking. So first instance here, there's a very large wildlife market in Bangkok that seems to be a big target for traffickers that are trying to move charismatic, like small species like otters, jerboas, fennec foxes into Japan. So that's definitely an issue we continue to see. Most of those traffickers claim that they are not moving or they are purchasing these animals for themselves, but at the same time they'll have like 15 animals. So almost certainly going into pet trade in Japan. We also see health risks associated with bird trafficking in Asia. This particular instance involved a bird that was infected with a strain of influenza, which, as I understand, was the apparent cause of an epidemic or a pandemic, in the 1800s. And then finally, this last example here involved a series of seizures, again, similar to the aquarium fish example that I just went through, that seemed to exhibit signs of organized criminal activity. They would go through an airport that didn't have scanners. They always moved the same species in very large quantities. They almost always moved things in air freight and almost always on this particular airline, Sriwijaya Air. I think the most important thing about this network is that after a ground handler that worked for Sriwijaya Air, who was directly involved in these trafficking attempts, was arrested, we have not been able to find any other seizures that have exhibited these characteristics, which I think really goes to show what targeted enforcement efforts can, the impact that they can have on these smaller to medium-sized networks. We could go to the next slide. We're going to get through it quickly. It's going to be great. Major hits from each of these slides. Your next slide, thank you. So just wanted to highlight here that repeat offenders are still a very prevalent issue within wildlife trafficking. We have in our recommendations some discussion of wanting to make sure that wildlife trafficking legislation is, or that penalties for wildlife traffickers are increased to try to dissuade people from wildlife trafficking. Jeffrey Lendrum is a good example of a repeat offender who will be sentenced to a short period of time in jail, get out, and then immediately try to do the same thing again. So that's what I wanted to highlight there. European eel trafficking, again, shows signs of organized crime. They seem to be several different networks operating in Northern Africa and Europe. And because this is such a big deal now, each of these seizures tends to involve tens, if not hundreds of thousands of eels. European law enforcement, especially in Western Europe, seem to be pretty familiar with this issue. And so we're starting to see trafficking attempts for European eels move towards Eastern Europe. So this one wasn't found in Croatia. And don't have time to go into the details of the seizure, but it was very clearly a network with the kind of leader of the network paying for the hotels and other things for the two traffickers that were arrested. And then finally, for Europe, I just wanted to highlight bushmeat and how big of an issue that is. I think, if I remember correctly, there was a 2010 study that estimated that 5 tons of bushmeat are trafficked through Charles de Gaulle every week, which is obviously a substantial amount, so definitely a huge issue. Some of that bushmeat is just passing through from West Africa or elsewhere, but a lot of it is also destined for African diaspora markets in European cities. And obviously that poses a really significant health risk to other passengers and just to all of us in general. Next slide. And keep going. And keep going. And keep going again. The main point I just wanted to make here is just that this graph on the right, just to showcase the difference between, well, we've gone past it, but it's okay. To showcase the difference between the number of seizures that the Middle East is able to make versus the number of trafficking instances that pass through the Middle East. It's really quite different. And I think that goes to show quite a lot about the way that transit hubs kind of engage or experience wildlife trafficking. And then finally, to the point that I made earlier about male seizures in Oceania, we can see here that there's about 52% of trafficking attempts or trafficking wildlife seizures in Oceania were seized from male shipments, which is obviously substantial. I'll also say that island nations like, or I guess continents like Australia, that have been separate from the rest of our other continents for such a long time, obviously have species that have evolved and are not able to deal with diseases brought into the country by other wildlife quite as well. So all of the live animal seizures, and most of the live animal seizures that we identified in a place like Australia, all the animals involved in that seizure have to be destroyed immediately to basically reduce the risk of spreading any kind of disease. So just that it's a very important issue in Australia. And we'll keep going. Sorry, if you could just keep. So I guess I can end with 2 more points. One thing on the recommendations. So we do have 19 recommendations included in Runway to Extinction. Some similarities, or a fair amount of similarities to the recommendations included in our previous 2 reports. The main thing that I wanted to highlight here, and so most of these recommendations that are highlighted white touched on this point, just that one of the major issues that we see within the air transport industry, or not within the air transport industry, but within, or that affects this issue, is just that there aren't great communication mechanisms between industry and the public and enforcement to be able to report, as I was saying before, red flags or potential instances of wildlife trafficking through airports. So that I think is a really great opportunity to increase and improve those communication channels, which I think would lead to quite a few more seizures, especially if it's accompanied by awareness-raising activities, so that anyone who's moving through airports basically is familiar with the red flags that they should be looking for. And then the only other thing that I'll highlight here before moving on is just that as passenger volume and cargo volume increases, coronavirus notwithstanding, it's really, I think, important for airports to do everything they can to pursue a shift towards electronic paperwork to try to be able to process CITES permits and airway bills and different things like that quickly so that they can incorporate risk rating software within electronic paperwork programs to be able to identify high-risk shipments. If volumes continue to increase without a corresponding increase in electronic mechanisms, then I think we're going to be in really a serious disadvantage pretty soon here. And another way to kind of address that issue, technology aside, is just sniffer dogs. They are able to screen more passengers, more cargo, more bags more quickly than a person would be able to do. So that's another definitely valuable investment. And then if we could just go to basically the second to last slide. Yeah. So one backwards. There we go. Thanks. So the other thing that I wanted to end with is just that we have quite a few things moving forward here. Two things I want to highlight in particular from C40S. We are producing an assessment on the health risks of wildlife trafficking that should be published in the next few months, if I remember correctly. So that will get at some of the issues that I know you all are very interested in directly. And then also we do provide our data and graphics through the routes dashboard, which is an interactive tool. So you're able to kind of manipulate the data that we have within our database to answer the questions that you have about wildlife trafficking through airports. And the routes dashboard is definitely something that we would like to continue working on post-routes. But to be able to do that, we'll either need some kind of source of funding or another organization who's willing to take on maintenance of this website. So if anyone on the call, if your organization would be interested in collaborating on this, definitely feel free to reach out to myself or to anyone else associated with routes because we'd love to talk to you about it. Sorry, it's a long presentation, so I'll end there. Thank you all so much, and definitely feel free to reach out to me with other questions. I'm happy to take them if I can.
Thank you so much, Mary. Just a few housekeeping items and then also a couple of questions here. As has been mentioned in the chat, this webinar recording, as well as all of the slides, will be available for download on the Routes Partnership website. So please go there if you would like to download either of those items along with the report. There are also a lot of other resources up there and available for your use. Mary, a couple of questions, and maybe Michelle, if you're still with us, if you can come back in. We've had several questions about lessons learned over the scope of the Routes Partnership about working with the air transportation sector. Would love your thoughts on what lessons we have learned, and in particular, what lessons we might take away from maritime sector, or how whistleblowers might play a role in helping to implement routes.
Thanks, Richard. Quite a lot of questions there. Quickly, I would say a lot of the lessons learned through routes is on both sides. I think there's been lessons learned around the topic of wildlife trafficking by the industry, but at the same time, I think for those of us who are not in the aviation sector, just learning about the complexities of how that sector works and where interventions can be done has been quite a steep learning curve as well. So I think in that aspect, I think routes has been first and foremost a learning ground for us all to understand and build our knowledge together as to what can be done. And I think in that context as well, it's also looked at, or the lessons we've learned is sort of, I would say very much so from the current situation, is moving this from a sort of discussion of environmental concern to a risk to a supply chain, a risk to the sector's survival in terms of tourism, in terms of local livelihoods, and also as Mary mentioned, so the associated risks with other illicit activities, other networks who are engaging in smuggling contraband, and as well as sort of the inside threats and the weakening of processes to make a legal trade possible. So I think those are our biggest lessons together of how we work together, at least. In terms of what people can do to support, and then I've seen on the chat as well, there's been questions about how can the airports contribute. I would say if you are from an airport, please do contact ACI Global, Juliana Scavuzzi. I know that they are actively working with their regional task forces on and with routes, and they would very much welcome anybody's support from their members and their interest from the members, and they will be able to loop you in with us all. So, and Hallie has just put up her email as well, so that's great. Please do reach out to us if you want more information. Now, in terms of maritime, we have worked on various projects as individual organisations around maritime, and I think probably the biggest lesson learned there is it's a very different beast to the aviation industry. Areas of intervention are different, the way it operates is different, but certainly as we look forward, I think the areas of overlap are very much the beginning point of the supply chain. So how freight is consolidated, the sharing of data, the knowing your customer, all those areas where you are looking to ensure that your supply chain is secure, no matter how that is then transported via air or via shipping lines or via road, that it becomes quite a critical point to know what you're dealing with and what is entering your legal trade chain. And that's, I think, where we would like to look more as we move forward to see what can be done at a preventative point rather than a reactive point. So for those of you who are asking what's going to happen with routes, we are definitely looking at that as we go forward. I hope that answered all the questions in a very quick way.
That was very good, Michelle. Thank you for that. Mary, one last question for you. One person asked about country level data. I think noticing that in some of those cases, there wasn't data for each country on each continent. Is that because of lack of data or because of lack of reporting and sharing?
For a wide variety of reasons. I know on one of our previous reports, we got comments back that one country, I believe in the coast of Africa, that is known to have wildlife trafficking by maritime or by vessel wasn't showing up in our data at all. And that could be either because of their airport screening protocols, it could be because of reporting, it could be because of data collection by the agencies that should be in charge of that within that country. It could just be that most of the wildlife trafficked out of that country move by maritime or by land or by rail. So it is difficult to say. For instance, Oceania, I would imagine there's quite a bit more wildlife trafficking going on there than we were able to identify. But it's quite possible that could be moving by maritime instead of by air, and so that might be why we're missing some of it.
Excellent. Well, I know we're over our time here, but I do want to thank Mary and Michelle and Cynthia again for their leadership, as well as for all of the information that you shared today. I also want to thank Hallie Sachs, who's shared her contact information here, as well as Celia Fisher from ACI for stepping forward to offer so many tools and resources for folks who are interested in this topic. So please do check those out. Check those out in the chat. There's some great links there. You can also get information by going to the Routes Partnership online through these different resources, both on Facebook and on Twitter, or by emailing info@routespartnership.org, and of course by visiting routespartnership.org on the World Wide Web. Thank you all for joining today's excellent webinar. Thank you, Mary. Thank you to the Routes Partnership and to USAID, and for all of those partners here who come together in such a fantastic effort. We really thank everyone for their time, and we look forward to learning more about what you're doing to combat wildlife crime. Thanks so much. Take care. Good day.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.